It looked like Philip, and it talked like Philip. It made love and did the dishes just like Philip. When it played with the kids, it laughed, joked, and reprimanded just like Philip. After a time, I truly began to forget the funeral and that horrible night when I had actually lost the original Philip. He'd been so young, and there was no way that any loving God would have cursed our family to be without him. That's why we had enlisted for the program in the first place. We had gone over our finances and taken out the necessary loan before going into the Yamashita cybernetics lab and had the small neural recorder placed in our frontal lobes. The recorder would act as a sponge of perceptions and reactions throughout our daily lives, and if the time ever came that one of us should die in some untimely manner, a full-scale replica could be made and the information uploaded. It just so happened that it was Philip who went first. It was a simple thing which took him. He was leaving the office for some coffee and a muffin, and then some perfectly ordinary young girl in a hurry to reach some appointment or other had smashed into him at 40 miles per hour, and then he was gone. I had never dreamed that he could be replaced, but the technicians assured me that in time I would barely even remember anything had even happened to my husband, and for the most part they were right. My new Philip was stronger, healthier, calmer, and more adept at bouncing our budget than the real Philip had ever been. There were times in the next few years that I was actually grateful for the accident. It's strange, but I had developed resentment against all the frailties my husband had possessed. This Philip never argued or refused to watch the kids while I went on a girls' night out. But there was one thing. In the early years of our relationship, Philip and I had been very experimental in many of our forays into lovemaking. There had been dirty movies and even a little blindfolding and tying up. Now, don't get me wrong, I've never been a fetishist or had some secret longing for submission, but there are always times when I thought how nice it would be to make things a little bit more interesting in the bedroom. It just so happened that I had been glancing through a particularly successful erotic novel, which was making the rounds through my book club. At work, everyone was constantly discussing their favorite details, and despite my half-hearted jokes about how ridiculous and stupid the book was, it had managed to fire off a spark in my libido. At home, I began flipping through the online manual, which I had downloaded upon the acquisition of my new Philip. I had never really taken the time to review it carefully, but I spotted a certain section which was headed Unlocking Fantasy. As I read on, I learned that by simply entering a certain security code, it would be completely possible for me to reinitiate certain repressed desires and fantasies in my Philip replica. That night, I sent the kids to stay with my mother and went about creating the makings of a romantic dinner. I bought several bottles of good wine and began sipping away with excitement as I awaited Philip II to come home from work, where he had just received a promotion. As he entered smiling, as he always did now, he asked where the kids were. I gave him a long wet kiss and informed him that this was a couple's night. He grinned gingerly and took his place at the table to carve up for the upcoming extravaganza of adult delights I had planned carefully throughout the week. I snuck off to the bedroom and logged in to my Philip II account, where I quickly entered the security code and initiated level 1 fantasy retrieval on my sexy replica. Within an hour, I was more than impressed with the results of my endeavor. I drank more wine as he massaged and performed every manner of delight on my body, but I was still thinking that just a little bit more may be in order. Once more, I typed away at the account and thus began level 2 fantasy retrieval. The next hour was as intense a sexual experience as we had ever had. Philip II was a sexual athlete of remarkable stamina and prowess. He played role games and indulged in other activities I will not mention, but by this time, I was stone cold drunk and was thinking of even more. That was when I initiated level 3. He encouraged me to keep drinking as he circled the bed and eyed me with the predatory hunger of an animal. I can only clearly remember him climbing into bed before I passed out. When I awakened, I was tied down to the bed. Not the friendly, fluffy handcuffs kind of bondage either. He had taken several of his leather belts and used them to lash me tightly to the posts. As I slowly began to gain lucidity, I realized that several areas of my body were bruised, and it seemed as if perhaps he had dislocated my shoulder at some point in the night's activities. I was now in excruciating pain as I screamed for him to untie me, but he was only laughing and smiling at that point as he withdrew his shining, straight-edged razor from the antique shaving kit that I had bought the old Philip 10 years before. "I always wanted to do this," he said wistfully as he approached. "It's a shame that the sedative wore off, but it will still be better if you're awake." He chuckled as he came closer. He then began what I can only describe as a sort of experimental surgery, which would last for what seemed like an eternity. He did his best to make sure that whatever he did was not immediately fatal. However, in time, I still lapsed into darkness from the enormous blood loss. From the best that I can figure, that was when the first Nancy died. When I came home from the laboratory, I immediately began setting about browsing the data from Philip II's account. Nancy, 1, had been such a terrible researcher and had never even really studied the psychological profile that Yamashita had compiled on her husband before his death. I mean, really. It was all right there in stunning detail. Poor Philip had been what was commonly referred to as a functioning psychopath. By all accounts, he had been born with a brain of a ravaging serial killer, but through the diligence of his parents and a secure home environment, he'd become a decent, contributing member of society. This did not mean that the man had complete run of his thoughts, but he never would have acted on them willingly. He had been imprinted with a strong and binding moral code, which prohibited him from acting on the basis of his desires. As I stand and prepare to go pick up the kids from daycare, it occurs to me that I owe my entire contented existence to Nancy 1's negligent disregard of a simple owner's manual. Thanks, Nancy.